Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Neha, and I work on product marketing here at Netlify. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome everyone to today's session, all about working with AEM. And this topic in particular was one requested by many of you via our DMs and our emails. So we knew we had to jump right to it. And who better to walk us through this than our very own Phil Hawksworth, who's a member of the developer experience team here at Netlify. And I think, Phil, before you became an ambassador for Jamstack and the whole composable web, you were actually in the Adobe Experience Manager world as a developer for a global design and advertising agency. Do I have that right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, working at a big ad agency, not building AEM, but certainly working on lots of projects where AEM was the platform. So yeah, that's true.
That's awesome. So, Phil, I know you have a lot of stories to share and a lot of lessons learned throughout the years. So without further ado, welcome, and let's jump right to it.
Okie dokie. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks very much for getting us rolling. I think I've got all my windows set up so that I can see chat, I can see Q&A. We'll see how we get on. I am going to start quickly with a bit of a very quick hello, but frankly, yeah, you've already done this. As you say, I'm Phil Hawksworth. I'm part of the DX team at Netlify. I always used to say to people, if you need to track me down and ask me questions outside of this session, you could find me on Twitter. Honestly, I'm not very active on Twitter these days for reasons, but I'm Phil Hawksworth in lots of places. Luckily, it's not a very common name. So you can find me on Mastodon and Indie Web Social. But frankly, the best way to get questions to me right now are just please interrupt. You know, I'm going to be telling a few kind of stories, frankly, it's going to be some anecdotes and some lessons is what this session is going to be about. But please feel free to interrupt me. I know not everyone can interrupt, but the Q&A tab is there. And Neha, just feel free to kind of, if there's a pertinent thing in the questions, or if you just feel the urge, I will not be at all upset if I'm interrupted mid-flow. So please feel free to do that, and we'll turn this into a bit of a conversation. Hopefully this will be a conversation as we get going anyway. I'm really, to be honest, I'm very, very interested to hear other people's experiences as well, and I think the conversation will probably be the most fruitful thing. Just a tiny bit of background about me for context setting. As you know, I'm part of the DX team at Netlify, and I used to work at RGA, who are a big kind of global brand advertising agency, as a tech director there. And prior to that, I worked at another agency, bafflingly called The Team, which was very, very difficult for capturing action items after the meetings. But that's a different webinar. And then before then, I worked at various companies, BT, VeriSign, VMware, various software houses, those kinds of things. But it's the last three that I think are particularly pertinent to this particular webinar, because in those roles, particularly the two agency roles, I'd be involved in working with clients, large and small, mostly large actually for these two particular agencies. There's lots of kind of public sector and then large kind of global brands, particularly at RGA. So I'll be working on projects with clients, trying to understand what the project needs were, how we would architect a solution, and then going and leading the teams in implementing that. So there was lots of kind of building for enterprises, and critically building for and working with enterprise architecture or architectures, because no two were quite the same, which was kind of part of the excitement. But there were some themes that were common along the way. Quite a few projects that used Adobe Experience Manager. And so this session will have a few stories and experiences from those days. I should start this by mentioning a bit of sensitivity here. I want to be a bit discreet, because I'll be honest, I'm not divulging government secrets or anything along those lines, but there is some sensitivity involved in some of these projects. And so I'm going to keep the brands and the companies I worked with anonymous for the sake of this. But that purely is because there is some sensitivity here. Which in itself is kind of an interesting thing. Why is there sensitivity about the projects that use a particular platform? Well, that's maybe one of the first things to call out, actually, about working with a platform product of this nature, because it's an expensive platform, and it involves a lot of decision making and investment to get there. So very often the fact that AEM is part of a solution does mean that there's been a very high profile kind of decision making process and some big vendor selection process that could be a little bit, well, political maybe is not the right word, but certainly there's been a lot of high level, high exposure investment in that. So big decisions, big investments there. So people are rightly kind of sensitive about talking about some of the experiences that they had, if good or bad. Also, there's often a very large sunk cost involved in building out platforms, building out the capabilities on a platform like this. It's typically not a quick kind of fire and forget quick project. Usually it's a multi-year project, many projects sitting on top of that, and that has lots of costs associated with it, licensing and effort and time and all the rest of it. So again, there is some sensitivity, particularly if there are some challenges there. So I want to be kind of respectful of that. And the other reason that there is some sensitivity here is because very often large companies working with Adobe or similar that does create kind of a dependency on that vendor, and we want to be respectful of that relationship as well. So for those reasons, there are some sensitivities. So I include that not just as a disclaimer, but also because I think that is kind of interesting in and of itself. So okay, onwards. I want to tell kind of 3 stories is maybe a grand word, but certainly 3 experiences I want to share. So the first one, we'll talk a little bit about kind of some unspoken costs and some kind of long tail costs on a project, and also just talk about the kind of the power of demonstrations and proof of concepts. The next one I'll talk about is going to really focus on how time is really important in projects. Shocker, what a revelation that is. But certainly in this particular instance, the time constraints were kind of a forcing function in here. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then another one which really just focuses a little bit on the efforts towards decoupling. So with that said, I'm going to just kind of drop these along the way. I'm kind of keen to see, and I see already in the chat, there is an invitation to ask questions, and really I'm kind of curious as people are going. I mean, you can drop these things into the Q&A, and we'll kind of loop back and discuss these along the way, at the end or along the way. But just a couple of kind of prompts for thinking about questions. When working with AEM, do you have any particular challenges that you're keen to overcome, or regular challenges, or particular things that either feel insurmountable, or maybe you've overcome them and those are interesting stories to tell yourself? And also, when selecting AEM in the first place, what was the biggest motivator to do that? I'm curious about all of these things. So if we harvest any of these things for conversation later on, all the better. So I'll drop 1 or 2 of these things along the way. Okay. As we get into story 1, I'll have a quick sip of tea. Excellent. All right, so story 1, the one I mentioned about unspoken costs and the power of demonstrations. And, I've given this a title of a short project made long. And the reason for that, I'm not going to show you visuals or diagrams or what have you. I'm just going to talk, but I am going to put up a few kind of prompts for me and things to be able to kind of reflect on as we talk. So a bit of context setting. This is a brand site for a very large enterprise organization. The site that we were working on here, this is when I was working at an agency, and we were engaged to design and build the front end for this that would then be implemented on AEM. The kind of site, it was a product site, so this had product pages, certainly less than 100 product pages, not a great deal of pages, but then also some editorial content as well. There was kind of blog and editorial pieces. So it wasn't a great many pages, a great many URLs really in the grand scheme of things, but it was localized for a number of different markets. So there was some translation, some localization going on, and so there were I think a dozen or so localizations, perhaps a tiny bit less than that. So that did multiply the complexity somewhat, but it still wasn't a very complex site, certainly in terms of experience, not complex at all. There was a real desire to have a real premium aesthetic and a real kind of luxury brand aesthetic coming through, which is one of the things that the agency I was working at kind of specialized in. And also this product needed to adopt component-based model based on the fact that this organization had invested a lot of time and effort building out components that lots of their brands could use and then enhance across the different brands. It was fairly early in their process for doing that, so it hadn't been executed on many brands yet, but that might seem familiar to folks who are working on multi-brand, kind of multi-tenant environments where you really want to kind of reuse a lot of the code and a lot of the kind of logic. Beyond that, the current incarnation of the site was having quite a lot of performance and device support issues. When I'm talking about performance, I'm talking about rendering speed and page load kind of performances, and also its support across different types of devices, which maybe dates the project a little bit because, or maybe it doesn't actually, maybe that's still a challenge, but certainly it was very front of mind for where the project was at the time we got involved. And the reason I described that this was having some issues already is because this wasn't a completely greenfield project. We're actually the latest in a string of many agencies who are involved to work on this, because many agencies had tried to tame this environment, this new kind of component-based model, and this platform to deliver the right experience, but many had failed. And so the organization has actually moved on and kind of relieved a few previous agencies of their responsibilities, and then moved on to new companies in the hope that others could do it. And we were just the last in a fairly long line of people who tried and failed, hoping to do our best and win here. So you might imagine that there was frustration for the brand, and frustration for the organization that managed that brand, and they really wanted to see this through to completion as quickly as possible. We were bringing design and front-end skills to this. We're specialists in those areas, and we were working with the organization's system integrator to bring that to life on AEM. So there are a few phases to this project, if you like. So many phases, well, not that many phases, but those phases took the project to run for almost 2 years. It was getting up towards that duration, which is alarming, I think, for building something of this nature, and that was due to some of the frustrations that we were encountering along the way, and the fact that we're struggling to get good performance out of the platform. I've long been an advocate for platforms that do a few things simply, rather than try and do every possible thing for every possible person, and I think that's particularly the case when it comes to content management systems. Often things try to be so general that they can support everything for everyone, and it's really hard to get the right skills and the right craft brought to bear through these platforms. So that's why I'm a real advocate of decoupling. The CMS aspect of this site was so complex that marketers couldn't use it, which meant that we required developers to use it, and the developers were experts in front-end engineering. They were not experts in wrangling AEM. So this created a real kind of strange environment where developers weren't really doing the things they were good at. They were learning how to use AEM and trying to bend it to their needs. This was problematic, and my position was this could be simpler, because the experience that we needed from the site actually was really quite simple. It was a write seldom, read often product-based site, so really didn't need a lot of dynamism when it comes to kind of publishing flows and interactions and what have you. So approaching 2 years, what I did at the point that we almost lost the account a number of times, and we lost developers from the company because they had such a tough time working on the project, I was so convinced that we could do this more simply that we decided that we would build a proof of concept. So I managed to persuade my bosses that we would have a bit of an investment here, and we kind of worked with the team at the client. And what we decided to do was have a 10-day project. And this is what we did. So we decided that we would build all of the page templates that existed. We'd build them off the platform. We wanted to demonstrate a different way of doing this. So we'd build them all as templates that would then be populated with just a sample of the pages. So we weren't populating every page. We wanted to demonstrate every single one of the page templates and show we could rebuild them and deliver them in a way that was much more performant. We were using a static site generator. I believe at the time we were using Jekyll for that, believe it or not, which is kind of opposite end of the spectrum to a product like AEM, which again, for me, just comes down to choosing the right tool for the job. And we'll perhaps tease out some more conversation about that. It's important to say this was not integrated into the CMS. So this was demonstrating purely the ability to deliver the front-end code, host it sensibly, and show some benefits by not being coupled to the monolith, which is AEM. So really wanted to prove out those aspects and also the development flow, but not proving out the content management system aspect of that. It's important to describe that. For this, we used one developer. It was a 10-day project. 9 days of that were building the thing, and 1 day of that was taking measurements and then preparing to demonstrate it. And what we demonstrated was a side-by-side comparison of the front-end performance, because this is one of the particular pain points for the brand and for the organization who operate that brand. They were very, very upset that we as an agency couldn't get the performance out of the platform. And like many of the agencies that had come before us, we were saying that it's difficult to get the performance out of the platform. So this is what we wanted to demonstrate. So we built a replica of the site with a cut down version of cut down volume of the content, if you like, but demonstrating each of the URLs, each of the templates rather. And we measured their performance in terms of site rendering speed and other kind of core web vitals in a side-by-side experience, so that we could then demonstrate that. And what we saw, and these numbers are alarming, I just summarize here, what we saw an average of a 10-second improvement on time to first meaningful paint, which is staggering really when you think that it could have been up in the 10-second area anyway. In fact, we were seeing first meaningful paint actually not arriving until 12, sometimes 15 seconds for some of the pages, which maybe illustrates the enormity of the problem we're having. So we were bringing these down to 1 or 2 seconds, which frankly is still a little high for my money. But we were doing the minimum amount of optimization and really just doing best practice, getting things away from some of the more expensive back-end processes and delivery considerations, just so that we could show the opportunity with the front-end code that was being built purely if it could be delivered in the right way. So this opened a few eyes, and it was certainly quite impactful, but of course it prompted a few other conversations. So it prompted questions about, okay, well, what about deploy time? If you're suggesting that we should pre-generate this site and then deploy it, does that mean that we've got to wait for long builds? And what's the content publishing flow? Well, in fact, you know, although, you know, again, with the caveat of this just being a sample of the pages and not every page, still I run static builds myself now on pages that have many thousands of sites that have many thousands of URLs and thousands of pages that take a few seconds to run. Here we're in a situation where it's far fewer than that, and a deploy could easily just take, you know, around a minute to complete. Whereas the publishing flow that they were currently undergoing would involve a content freeze, a code freeze, and a deployment team to get involved. I don't know if other people have been in the situation where you have a deployment team. It feels like that is starting to become more of a memory rather than a regular occurrence, but it's not unheard of. And so I'm curious to know what kind of deployment processes and lead times people currently have when they're deploying code updates and content updates. But certainly that was a question that was asked, and one that I felt we had a very good answer for. Other questions were about localization and personalization. This proof of concept we built out had no localization, but that's a solved problem. We had the templates for that. We had the content abstractions, and extrapolating out how many URLs this would have, that would still mean a very, very manageable deployment time that I would not be worried about. The content management of that is a different question. But again, this is becoming more and more a solved problem with decoupled and headless CMS products. We're seeing it many times now. Personalization similarly, and in fact, personalization was, I believe, one of the core reasons that AEM was chosen to serve this, because there was a desire to personalize the content for the experience for the individuals visiting the site. But none of that had been designed. I think to this day, none of that has been implemented. So I'm not going to go down that personalization journey, other than to say sometimes that is a list of requirements that is a desire that hasn't been designed out and planned out. So that requires careful thinking. And Another piece, what about interactive content if we're going to be generating this statically? Well, there was a small amount of interactive content on the site when it was in AEM, but that was provided by third-party scripts. That was not something that was provided by the platform itself. Like many enterprises, there were arrangements with third-party vendors who would provide things like ratings and reviews, the ability to purchase products quickly, which were JavaScript drop-ins, which frankly performed poorly for a performance point of view and could be delivered differently. They weren't being delivered by AEM, but that was a regular drop-in. These days, I would personally be trying to render some of these things on the edge or using progressive enhancement for that. But again, that might lead us into some other topics we might return to later on. And of course, the other question was about content management, which I've already mentioned, the fact that a decoupled or headless approach can feed exactly this kind of site build and bring all of these benefits all at once. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But what I just wanted to kind of call out here is that by doing a small spike of activity on demonstrating a proof of concept that was using the same exact designs, same exact templates, but with giving the developers the freedom to exert their craft, we're able to bring the performance far more in line with what we were expecting, what the client was expecting, and really kind of circumvent some of the challenges we were having. That didn't lead to the move from that platform to the model that I created, or I demonstrated rather, but it certainly started the organization on a path to some conversations a little bit later on. I think I'm seeing a question which I'm tempted. Let me just read this while I'm here. I'll see if I can read it without moving my lips, because reading and presenting all at the same time. Now, how to convince my technical leaders in my company Netlify CMS is a better choice than AEM for the provided solution to the client. Okay, so thanks for your question, Alfonso. I'll talk about that just for a moment. Why not? As we're going along. So first thing to note, Netlify CMS is, or rather I should say was, because it's now been renamed and is now under the stewardship of another agency rather than under the stewardship of Netlify, but the project lives on. It's an open source project now called Decap CMS. This existed purely to fill the gap when the gap was there for content management systems to work in a Git-based deployment flow. So in other words, static site generators that would be triggered to run their build based on a continuous integration, continuous deployment kind of pipeline. Those would typically pull in content from a repo, from a Git repository, run their build, and the output would be put to a CDN or some other kind of hosting environment. At the point that model was becoming popular, there wasn't really a Git-based content management system that could plug into that. So you only had large, expensive proprietary CMSs to help with that. So Netlify CMS was kind of instigated as a good way to bridge that gap. Since then, lots of other CMSs have come onto the market. Some are Git-based, some are API-based, but they can all work in this kind of decoupled, headless way. The way in an answer to your question, Alfonso, how to convince your technical leaders that Netlify CMS is a better choice? Well, I don't think I can argue for that, actually. I don't think I can argue that one particular thing would be better for your project than AEM, because it depends on your project requirements. It really does. It depends what other things need to integrate into it, what the skills of your team are, and also the kind of publishing and team workflows that you might need. So I hate to say it depends, but it really does depend on a lot of those things. I would argue, though, that it's very worth considering a decoupled CMS, whether that's Netlify CMS or Contentful or Sanity or one of the many, many others that exist, because that is the key that we were kind of demonstrating with this little prototype, that by not making the CMS responsible for the rendering and the delivery of the pages and the execution of the templates, it meant that your front-end engineers could exert their craft, build something that's very, very performant, which is abstracted from the job of turning content and templates into views. So I think demonstrating, so arguing that, and then also being able to show examples of those kind of deliveries and sites that run in that particular way and seeing how they perform, I think that can really help. And in this instance, building a prototype and then showing them side by side was very, very compelling and really started the conversation. So I hope that answers that. I'm going to keep looking at questions as we go, because we will get into the stories. I think I'm looking at my timer. Are we okay?
We are good, Phil. So thank you for that question, Alfonso. I see we have another question here from Tim. How does this approach work if the team is heavy on editorial/production staff, but light on developers? Does it require a permanent dev team with different skills than AEM devs? Does the dev team get bigger with this approach? Great question, Tim.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I found on a number of projects that used AEM was that the desire, as you quite rightly say, if there's a heavy editorial production staff team who want to be writing content and just using the platform, not building the platform, using the thing. What we found on all of the projects I worked with AEM, and I can't say that I've worked on every type of project. So some people, your mileage may vary, and so I'm very here to see if anyone else has different experiences. But what resulted was not a content management platform or process that actually was very approachable to content managers and authors. In fact, what we found is that the only people able to use the content management system that was the result of the project were developers. The problem being that their skills were in front-end engineering or some other aspect of engineering. They were not AEM specialists. And even when some of the projects did have AEM specialists, they weren't specialists in the shape that this deployment had been crafted into, or the content model or the page models that were exerted. So in actual fact, we found the friction in publishing really, really grew in this regard. So the other side of the coin of this, if we are able to go to a decoupled approach, typically what we find is that there are products which are built purely to be managing structured content and structured data. Again, many of these headless decoupled CMSs, their job is purely around managing the content. They're not around crafting the code or generating the resultant code that then works its way to the browser. So in actual fact, as long as the content is modeled carefully, and that's a big part of planning and approaching one of these projects, I think, the approach to structuring the content is always important, no matter what platform. If that is structured thoughtfully, then the user interfaces and the publishing workflows from some of these focused headless CMS products, I believe, are far superior and far more logical and tailored for that specific purpose and approachable for people who aren't just purely developers. So I find that actually really helps with this rather than becomes a hindrance. It does also demand that you have a really good, rigorous separation of your templates and the logic of those templates and the management of and the content that flows into them, which is actually a really good thing, because certainly at the agencies I've worked at, they were frankly very expensive, and there was a lot of emphasis put on designing on PSDs exactly how these experiences would look, really nudging pixels like left, right, and center with stakeholders and design teams over long periods of time that you then implement to the best of your ability, and then giving complete freedom to whoever has the keys to the CMS to say, this is great, but I'm going to make this bit of text bold because it matters to me more, or I'm going to put it over here. So it's incredible what kind of attrition you see very quickly in the experience and the design of sites once you've just given complete freedom or even partial freedom, rather than a very rigorous structured template, which is then protected. So yeah, you really see different experiences there, and then they're not always for the better. So I want to reflect on your question again. Does it require a permanent dev team with different skills than AEM devs? So yes, I think it is a different set of skills to AEM. Ultimately, I think that's much more available. And we certainly found that recruiting people who had good front-end development skills with whatever framework or whatever tool set fits your use case, your product, the use case of the site you're building, but also the team and the company you're a part of. those were much more readily available and often popular for people to work in. So it was good for team retention and all those kind of things as well. Okay. What do you think? Should we keep moving along? Are there any other questions we should?
I think we can take on these two questions. I don't want to keep these folks waiting, Phil. So
Totally.
we have a question here. Did you use AEM Visual Page Editor, SPA Editor, or Content Fragments? Did the content publish workflow generate new static pages?
Okay, so yes, there was the Visual Page Editor was being used. So I'm actually not familiar with the SPA editor, but the Visual Page Editor was being used. This was something that was set up by the system integrator, but then a lot of work was done in collaboration with our front-end team to try and to bring that into shape. And the publishing workflow, no, that did not generate static pages. They could very well have been. For all intents and purposes, the experience was they were baked, and so there was no personalization that was going on to there. But that generated pages that went through various levels of caching in front of there. But strictly speaking, they were still being published on request, if you like. So yeah, the Visual Page Editor was what was being used there. This is a little while ago. Yeah. Okay.
Sweet. Let's take this one more question from Alfonso, Phil, then we can jump right back into your presentation.
Sure.
Is it true Netlify CMS is developed from backend layers with Node.js or JavaScript from server side, and AEM is developed with Java? So the learning curve for front-end developers is less complex for Netlify CMS applications development.
Okay, so once again, this is kind of focused on Netlify CMS, but there's probably a couple of other things to kind of pull from this as well. So Netlify CMS or Decap CMS as it's now known is a React application, if you like. It's they're statically served React views that then talk to a Git API, if you like. So yes, that's built in JavaScript. It doesn't use Node.js. It is purely a client-side application for page administrators, but it is built in JavaScript. It's an open source project that you can extend and use with JavaScript. I'll be very honest, I don't know what AEM is under the hood. I suspect it may well be Java, but I don't know that for a fact, if I'm honest. This is a little while ago, some of these projects. But regardless of that, the development and the use of AEM really means that you need AEM experienced developers and engineers and consultants on it. So they need skills on that particular product and that platform, regardless of the language. But certainly I think that once you put JavaScript as the kind of core, you've got a bigger pool of developers. But I wouldn't want to say this kind of technology is better than this kind of technology, because once again, it depends on what you're doing with it. But certainly I think it's fair to say that some of these other tools that we'll maybe talk about along the way, not just Netlify CMS, but some of these models, gives you access to a larger pool, I think, of engineers and of maybe different types of engineers also. Okay, I'll keep one eye on the questions, and I know you'll interrupt me. Thank you so much for doing that as we go. But I'm kind of curious, if there are other challenges. Just going back here to these things, I wonder, what other challenges people might kind of raise at this point of doing this kind of prototype, just as another little thought starter for, well, this little prototype's fine, but what about? I'm kind of curious to know about the what about. Okay, I'm going to transition across quickly to another kind of experience. And so this was actually this is working with a different organization, a different brand, but it was an AEM project. And this is the one where I mentioned that that time constraints were things that really kind of factored here. So we'll take the similar kind of approach to this in terms of how we describe it. So this was a campaign site. This wasn't a product site or something that was going to live in perpetuity. This is a campaign site for a very large, well-known brand, which again, I'm going to be respectful and not name. I just want to kind of keep that in mind each time. But this was for a campaign site that was going to have a limited life. It was going to live for perhaps 2 months and then be gone. It was really something to accompany a physical event that was happening. This type of site we were building here, it had very few pages. It had around 5 pages, very visually rich, very cool stuff. I was excited to work on it, but just a small number of pages. Those pages would change state over the course of the campaign. So it would be a pre-event stage, there'd be a during the event stage, and there'd be an after the event stage, and maybe 1 or 2 along the way. So maybe like 4 or 5 states that the site would be in at particular points in time, but very, very few pages, very, very few URLs. There was only 1 language, and there was no content management. It was really something to purely accompany a particular event for a campaign. And as I mentioned, the site would be retired shortly after that. The thing that made this exciting might not be the right word, but certainly caused a lot of discussion at the agency when I was working on it, was this had a very short lead time. So from the point that we were engaged to say, can you come up with a concept and deliver it? It was 6 weeks from then until the event. And we needed, remember, to have the site launched ahead of the event for, I forget, if I'm honest, how many days. It may have been, let's say, less than a week before the event. That needed to be a kind of a preamble to the event then. And another constraint to this is that it must use the global delivery platform that organization had invested many, many millions of dollars on, and that was the platform that all projects would need to use. So one of the reasons that this became very interesting to us is that given that we had less than 6 weeks to develop it and to deliver it, working with their internal infrastructure teams, and again, this is not a criticism of those teams. It's a very, very common environment situation for many enterprises to be in, particularly when they're working with very large, complex infrastructure, is their lead time to provide us a development environment that we could then work on and build the experience on with AEM was 4 weeks. That's the lead time they described to us. And once we had that development environment that we could start proving the development out on and working on, if we wanted to then move that to a QA stage and a staging and a production environment, there'd need to be an audit of that configured development environment that would go through several loops before those things happened. So this was time sensitive is the way I might describe it. It was kind of interesting. Luckily for us, that was the case, to be very honest, because the kind of site that I was describing, at the start of that list, I don't believe needs to be hosted in a very complex way. It has a very, very simple set of requirements. It's the kind of thing that is perfect for pre-generating it and then serving it very, very effectively from the CDN directly, rather than using something more powerful, you might say, feature-rich and expensive. So the fact that we couldn't get a development environment within those 4 weeks was actually a real boon for us, because it meant that time was a forcing function for us that meant that we had to do something different as a stopgap until the environments were ready. So that's what we did. We had a stopgap development environment, as I called it, which was production ready. It just so happened that the environment we're going to build on I determined was perfectly suitable for production. And so that was provided, while the formal environment was being provisioned. So we didn't say, no, we're not going to need it, because that wasn't an option for us. We had to build it that way. But we said, while that's being provisioned, we're going to prototype and we're going to build the front end, which frankly was the entire site. We're going to build that as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we're going to deploy it on Netlify. And so it was kind of being used as a prototype, but since it was on Netlify, it's production ready, because the development environment is the same as the production environment. It's all in the global infrastructure. So this was really helpful for us, because it also meant that we could have the stakeholders at the client review things right there on URLs in our feature branches. Each time we built out another part of the experience, that would be something that they could see immediately and then get to go through sign off. And we also, could build out all of the different phases of these timed elements of the campaign and demonstrate how we would turn those on and off through the way that we promote different deploys to production. And so some of the problems, some of the difficulties or the challenges that they were trying to figure out exactly how they could do some of these other pieces were kind of solved problems already in the quote unquote prototype environment, which just so happened to be production ready. The formal environments never made it on time. They simply weren't, it wasn't possible to get them to us in time to make use of, even given the fact that we'd built all of the front end, all of the site on a different piece of infrastructure, which we could have just moved those assets across. The provisioning just couldn't happen in time. So in some ways, that's a real problem for the client and for the infrastructure team. But from my point of view, it kind of went wonderfully because we had this forcing function that meant that we had to build this in a different way. We had to prove out a different concept, a different approach. And the fact that the development environment was actually production ready and we could give them assurances of compliance and performance and SLAs and all the rest of it, and that the flows were all proven, it kind of meant that we got our prototype proof of concept by stealth, but it was just do it live, do it in production, which is not for the faint of heart, but in this context worked perfectly and actually gave us way more confidence than building another way. So on the back of that, I'm kind of curious about provisionings and approval processes that maybe some of you have had, depending on the kind of environments you work in, the kind of organizations you work in. I fully expect that there's compliance things you have to worry about, approval processes for provisioning environments. So I'm kind of curious about whether that is just a solved problem for you, or if that is a challenge, and if you've got techniques for expediting. Certainly 7 years ago, me would appreciate that. It's a bit easier for me now, but still, this is an important thing that I'd like to understand the challenges of. I think I see another question. I might just jump to that at this stage, if that's cool, because Tim asks, can you deploy to UK only infra on Netlify if that's a client requirement? Now, so this isn't an area of expertise for me, but I do know that, well, first of all, we're talking about a CDN that we're deploying to, which is a global network, a content delivery network, which is global, so that you are trying to get items close to the users that are requesting it. So that isn't UK only, that is global. I am aware of there being some enterprise clients that we've had where we've shaped some of this specifically for them to avoid some sensitive territories. I'm not confident in my answer that I could give about UK only infrastructure. So I might have to come back to you on that one, Tim. But certainly some level of customization has been possible for some clients in the past, but to give you a proper answer, I should come back. Cool. Okay. All right, I see another question. I'm just freestyling now. I hope this is okay. Seeing another question. Provisioning and approval is a relevant issue for us as well. We just completed a big corporate rebrand build, and the time to onboard was a lesson learned for us. Okay, I think that's great. That's less of a question for me to handle, but more just kind of a recognition that this is it's comforting for me to know that I was not special in this, and others are experiencing this also. Yeah, it can be very hard, particularly the enterprise space. I'm particularly conscious of that. Okay, I'm going to keep moving along, but keep these questions coming in. This is great. All right, so the third one, I'm just checking my time. Okay, we're fine. It's about proving a concept. So this really was a return to one of the two previous organizations that I described about. I'm being very cagey. I'm sorry. I'm not normally this aloof. But yeah, it was a return to one of the companies that we'd worked with before, and they were interested in doing more based on what we'd seen and what we'd proved out. So, but they really wanted to consider how could we make use of AEM and continue to use that, as there'd been a lot of investment there and a lot of work to integrate things into it. Could we still make use of that, but decouple it so that it's no longer responsible for generating those views and delivering those views so that we could be building the front end in the way that we might like. So what we did there is, again, I mentioned it was a very large enterprise and a global brand that we were going to be working on for this. They're very eager to see if this kind of a composable architecture and a decoupled architecture could work for them, and also how they could get more access to the Netlify workflow that they'd experienced on the previous examples that we'd worked on, because that was something that was particularly compelling to them, being able to hook into their continuous integration, have automated deploys, and URLs that people could collaborate on. As I say, there was a desire to have this as an additive approach to AEM, so they weren't having to invest in a different content management system, but make use of what they had, but still gain access to this front end. So what they decided to do is that we'd dedicate a small team just for a short spike on this well-known brand site as a bit of a proof of concept, with the intent of ultimately launching that. It was a small team. There were people from the platform team, so that's the team that build out the infrastructure for all of this company's brands that other brands get to work on, or to make use of, rather. It was one of the developers from one of their partners, who's their SI, that would be building the code, and also a product owner was in there as well, just to make sure that the needs of this particular product site were being faithfully kind of satisfied. And so we locked ourselves in a room for a week or two, and we worked on this. And what we really wanted to prove out is that we could expose the content that was already in AEM managed for an existing site, this existing brand site, but take that and reuse it, repurpose it in this kind of decoupled way. So that involved working with AEM to see if we could expose the content as JSON-based APIs. And then what was going to happen is that we would play those results back, record the results and play those back to a number of senior stakeholders for that organization to make recommendations for moving to this model. And I'm very happy to say that it was very successful in many regards, almost. It did not land in the way that I had hoped, because although we managed to prove out the development workflows, we managed to prove out the use of the site generator and framework that the team was keen to make use of, we're able to create the right kind of experiences and the right kind of performance. But the thing that we weren't able to do, sadly, was we weren't able to get the content from AEM. Now, I'm not saying that this is not possible. In fact, it's one of the directions that AEM is really investing a lot in, I gather, at the moment, embracing the ability to work as a decoupled CMS. So it's absolutely possible. And at the time we were working on it, it was possible, but it was difficult. And I think one of the reasons that this was difficult, and it certainly wasn't possible within, I think it was a 2-week project we undertook. It wasn't possible within that 2 weeks to do that. And I think one of the reasons I'd say for that is due to the content modeling, because the content for the site had been structured in such a way that it could be used within the kind of page builder there in AEM. The level of abstraction was really not there to present it well as a JSON API that you could make requests to populate your pages. So in fact, we struggled with this for a while, and in the end, we were not able to prove out the part that really would have unlocked this project, I think. So that was disappointing. I'd also say that at the point that we presented our results back to the set of stakeholders and proved out successfully a lot of the pieces of this, and then not this piece, there were quite a few questions from people working in the infrastructure team who've been used very much to working with AEM, who were asking us about how would we solve one problem or another, or particular things that weren't part of this project, but were absolutely things that you'd ultimately need to do with localization and personalization. Localization is a solved problem, particularly in sites of this nature, when it comes to statically generating content, or even generating content, delivering content from the edge. the abstraction of content from templates means that localization can certainly be a solved problem. We've got lots of lovely examples of that. Personalization is a little bit more difficult, but again, very, very doable and achievable. We've got lots of nice examples of that. But it was interesting having those questions posed as, you won't be able to do this because what about localization and what about personalization? And so what I found myself asking very much was, that's interesting. How do you currently do it? And often it was interesting to learn that the answer to that is, well, we don't yet, or we can't yet. So that's a tiny aside, and maybe a glimpse into some of the atmosphere that might have been created in this stakeholder meeting. Very interesting discussions came from that. So I'm curious if any of you have explored headless architectures with or without AEM, and also to get a better understanding, to be very honest, of the current state of affairs with with content APIs. Saying JSON is very distracting when there are people around called JSON. JSON APIs is what I'm referring to. So I'm very curious to know how that's evolved and what kind of experiences people had, because certainly the explorations I've done and the project teams and AEM experts that I've worked with struggled with that in those contexts. So I'd be interested to know if there are different contexts where that does better, because decoupling these things and getting the best of the front-end world and delivery world, maybe with some of the infrastructure that's already been heavily invested in, may well be very much of interest. Okay, we're getting through time, so I do see some other questions, and then I'm getting into lessons. So, what do you think, Neha? Should we do this last section, or should we jump into the questions? I don't like to leave the questions dangling.
Yeah, we can jump into some of your questions that have come in.
Okay.
We have one from James here. Did any of these use cases involve user authentication for purposes of preference management, loyalty, sweepstakes, enrollment, coupling authenticated users with CRM, etc.?
Great question. Great consideration. No, none of these did. None of these use cases had any of that. Both the first example, in fact, yeah, the first and the third example both had desires to do that, and desires to have, well, not all of those things, but certainly user authentication, preference management, and things along those lines, and targeted content and personalized content. I know kind of personalization is a bit of a spectrum between, being global and being personal, and there's a lot of steps in between. But yeah, both of those projects had ambitions towards that. They didn't have the content strategy to justify that, but it was an ambition, but it was certainly not something that was implemented in any of the product executions that I was aware of for that organization on the platform. But it's absolutely a kind of capability that is important to be able to manage. And with more time and maybe in a different webinar, we could talk about some of that in the Jamstack scenario. But certainly those are important. Actually, okay, I'm going to go on a slight tangent for a second. I promise I'll come back. So actually, we underwent. So Netlify did do a hackathon with an organization recently that wanted to do some of these kind of things with a Netlify stack, Jamstack architecture, and using some decoupled tools as well. And they actually built out with edge functions, Netlify edge functions, ways to do personalization and content targeting and recommendation based on what users had navigated through the site, and they built that out in their hackathon. Really interesting stuff. But I'm sorry, I digress. We should come a webinar for another day. But thank you for your question. Is there another one here? I think was there one from Tim I saw. Yes, to Tim Saunders. I'm just going to read this one out. Sure. We're using headless AEM on a project at the moment. Great. It's still a pain to work with content fragment models. Okay. Plus, you still need AEM specialists to make sure the API endpoints are configured correctly. Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like there's kind of good news and bad news there. The fact that it is possible, and I was kind of aware that it was. Sad to hear that it is still a bit of a pain. You need AEM specialists for that. I don't know if that's something that will improve over time, but I'm encouraged to hear that it is possible to begin exposing the content for other things to build on top of. I'd be interested, Tim, to kind of follow up that at some point and just kind of learn more about that experience and maybe get some tips from you on how that has gone. Okay. We still have another couple. Shall I keep digging in to these?
Let's do one more quick question from Anita, and then let's wrap it up in case folks have to jump out. But we have this question from Anita. How is Netlify different from Contentful?
Oh, okay, great. Thanks for that question, Anita. Okay, so Netlify and Contentful actually provide two very, very different things. So Contentful is a headless CMS. So they are a CMS as a service product where you can model your content, manage your content. Your authors can edit content there, and then that exposes the content through APIs that your site architecture can consume, generate the views and output. Netlify is not a content management system. Netlify is if you can think of it almost like a glue layer. It's the environment that can run your builds, take in that content from Contentful's APIs, combine it with your build, your code that generates your views, and then take the result of that and then publish that to a content delivery network, so that it is the thing that kind of runs your build and publishes it and hosts it, rather than the content management system, which is decoupled. So Netlify can work with any content management system. Contentful is a great one that exposes content in a way that's useful for these kind of builds. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Okay, I will wrap up with these last few points, and I think we're going to be pretty well on time. So a few of the lessons that I've learned, which hopefully will have come out along the conversation, is that there are great opportunities to prove multiple concepts. You know, when we worked on the first proof of concept, just to show that the front end we could deliver the front end code that would, you know, based on these designs, these visual designs, that would be fit for purpose. It gave us an opportunity to measure and contrast them with what was being output from other things. But what we hadn't anticipated is that this proof of concept also allowed us to demonstrate the workflows and the values in kind of less obvious areas. So the actual ways that developers could run their project, they could build things and prove them out, and this kind of continuous workflow. So building a proof of concept actually allowed us to demonstrate many concepts, and that yielded all kinds of great results. So proof of concepts and demonstrations for the win, I say. Inertia and pushback is another area to be mindful. You know, there's deep investment in big infrastructure, particularly at large organizations, and that brings deep commitments. People have invested a lot of time, effort, energy, money in these things. So you should expect resistance. It's not the kind of thing that people will very quickly say, yep, you're right, we should put that in the bin. Nor indeed should they. Everything should be taken very, very carefully and in a very considered approach. So I would say expect resistance if you're looking to make changes here, but stay pragmatic. You know, we shouldn't just say, I have the hammer that will, you know, be perfect for every nail. There are lots of different types of projects, lots of different types of tools. Pragmatism, I think, really wins out. And also, you might often find like whataboutism starting to surface when you're looking at the challenges. As I mentioned in some of the calls, you know, your prototype doesn't do this. How would you ever do this? Or what about some of the other things that are currently difficult to achieve? And so I think it's important to seek out what are the existing solutions. If a platform is in place that claims to service those, provide solutions to those problems, great. What are they? How do you currently do those things, and what can we learn from them? And if there's an absence of those solutions, then that's perhaps an opportunity, and an opportunity to learn as well. This is maybe a key one, and I'm conscious of time now, so I'll go quickly. It's not all or nothing. You know, we don't have to say you've invested a ton of money and effort in AEM and now we're going to replace it. Absolutely not. You can add things in a very gradual way. You don't have to take a bigger bang approach. You can be additive about this. There's a great pattern. I've got a video here. I'll share the slides to this afterwards, by the way. We'll make sure these slides are available. There's a video that I linked to here, which looks at a very, very simple, kind of beguilingly simple approach to adding Netlify as a layer in front of infrastructure, so that per URL, when you've got a page that could be served statically or pre-generated or from a different, a different platform with Netlify, that can be done, and then everything else falls through to the existing infrastructure. It's a very, very good way of gradually migrating, either fully or just partially, to something else. And also, selecting a pilot project which can, which has easily assessed risk, is a great way of proving things out in a real world instance, rather than in a prototype that really you get a lot of learnings from. So finding a well-scoped small project that you can work on, really, really helpful. Okay, I've gone a bit faster than I would have liked at the end, so apologies, I've been waffling along the way, but that is the end of my slides. I'm happy to stay around for as long as people like for chatter, but yeah, that's that. So thanks for listening. Oh, I think you're on mute again, Neha.
Oh, whoops. Well, thank you,
go.
Phil, for sharing all of your insights and fielding all of those questions from everyone. Really appreciate it. For those that tuned in but want to share Phil's talk with maybe their colleagues or friends, it will be up on Netlify's YouTube channel within a couple days, so stay tuned to that. If you registered for the webinar, you will also be receiving a recorded version of it via email, so keep your eyes peeled on your inbox. And other than that, I think we have a few more questions that came in, Phil, so for anyone who would like to stay on for a couple more minutes, Phil's gonna wrap up with these couple of questions, and then we're good to go.
Cool. Excellent. All right. So let's see. So just let's finish up with some of the conversation that happened with Anita, who was asking about Netlify and Contentful. She also asks, does Netlify help with personalization? It sounds like you were alluding to that. Correct. So yes, Netlify itself, again, Netlify itself does not build that for you. But it is a perfect platform for building things that can allow for personalization. The reason I hesitate with that a little bit is just because Netlify does have an identity product that can allow you to help you to provide authentication and authorization to things. It's a library, but it also allows you to integrate with kind of third-party identity providers. But that's just that one piece of the puzzle. To actually build out the way that you would present personalized content to your particular project, that is going to be down to how you want to build your product. So that's why I hesitate a little bit to say it can do that for you. But certainly, yes, it can help with that. And there are also a lot of very, very capable third-party authentication and authorization libraries and tools that can help build that, no matter what your stack. So I hope that helps. Hope that helps with that particular question. Meanwhile, over in the Q&A tab, great, thanks, Anita. So let's go in reverse order. So Alfonso, from my own experience, I can say it's very difficult to consume JSON APIs from AEM. So how can we consume APIs from Netlify CMS for our web application? So this sounds to me, Alfonso, like a question perhaps about the structure of the content in those APIs, and also the shape of your application that you've got built to consume those. The fundamental model is the same between those two things, whichever tool is generating a feed of content for you. The mechanics are the same, although now I read that again, Netlify CMS didn't expose an API. It actually populated assets within a Git repository, which your build would use. But I think the question probably is more about how can any other tool be used to kind of feed content to your web application if you're finding it difficult for JSON APIs coming from AEM. And ultimately, it is the same thing. But really, I think a lot comes down to the structure of that content. Exposing the content in a way which is logical for how you are going to want to use it is key. So being able to, whether that involves having kind of a graph API interface so that you can be very structured in what you query for and how you expect that data to come back, that can be one useful solution. And various tools provide that to various degrees. But equally, if it was a REST API, just knowing that the content structure that you express over that API, that is super important as well. So the fundamentals are the same, and I certainly wouldn't argue that those are different. Really, the complexity, I think, comes in, you know, what your application needs and how that backend is capable of delivering it in the format and the structure that you need. So I hope that addresses what you're asking about. And then the last question I see here: how do you see the difference in terms of integrating towards third-party platforms like customer intelligence, personalization, go-to-market, etc.? Is composable architecture a better choice in terms of effort, time to market, skill sets? Well, that's a big question, and again, it very much depends on what we're building. I'm really cautious about saying no matter what, this is the best tool for the job. I just think it's you get yourself in trouble if you say that. However, I would say that there are very, very capable tools and services for everything you're describing. It really does depend on the kind of experience you're trying to craft in your site in terms of how you go about doing that. An example I often come back to when people ask me about just the level of capability that something that kind of pre-rendered or indeed a composable architecture versus something that's either monolithic or built and served on demand, is I sometimes just point to the example of app.netlify.com and www.netlify.com. They're two very different sites and very different experiences. Netlify, and I use them because they're very familiar to me, but also often people are familiar with them as well if we're having this kind of conversation. So www.netlify.com is a marketing site. It's pre-generated and it's content managed. It uses a composable architecture to pull in things from a few different services, but ultimately it's a write sometimes, read very often site. It's not transactional. That's not a difficult conversation, I think, to be talking about for that kind of infrastructure and that architecture. App.netlify.com is a web application. It's quite different. It has authentication. It has some similar views for everybody, but the content within them is personal to them. It's based on integration with lots of different services, APIs, real-time updates of items in there as well. And so and that effectively is using a composable architecture, and it's also using a bunch of statically generated assets being served from a CDN. We build Netlify on Netlify, which is never confusing in conversations, but ultimately it's a really good demonstration of the ability to do lots of very rich things along the lines of personalization and authentication and many of the things you describe using this kind of architecture. So we believe here at Netlify very, very strongly in that. That's the way that we've been able to do things very, very rapidly, and we think it's very powerful. It does mean that you need to have some skills in this kind of architecture, and but you can also offset that by making use of all of the skills that come from some of those vendors, so that they can carry the load of those particular things. So I've meandered all over the place in my questions and answers and navigating through these slides. So I know we're probably a little over time now. So hopefully that's been useful to folks. But I think we managed to mop up all the questions.
We are good, and that's a wrap.
Oh, I don't hear you.
Thank you again, everyone. Can you hear me, Phil?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. So yes, that is a wrap. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Phil, again, for all of your great insights, your presentation. Again, as Phil mentioned earlier, reach out to him on Twitter if you have any questions, slide into his DMs. And I did just pop over the link in the chat to Netlify's YouTube channel, where you can find the recording of this webinar, as well as all our past ones that we've had recently on our channel as well. So stay tuned for our next ones. We have another one coming up next week and the week after that. So we're on a roll lately. So be sure to tune in and tell all your friends about it. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye now. Bye.